Metabolism is how your body takes stuff from the outside and makes it part of your inside. That's what metabolism is. There are two parts to metabolism: burning and growth. So, stuff in the outside, which we call food, is consumed, digested, absorbed, and finally metabolized. If you're burning, you're turning that food into energy. If you're growing, you're turning that food into bone, muscle, brain, kidney, liver, and virtually every other organ. Burning occurs in a part of the cell called the mitochondria. And every cell has mitochondria. And cells that burn more energy need more mitochondria. Like, for instance, the brain have the most mitochondria because it has to generate the most energy, because neurotransmission is a very energy-intensive effort. So, mitochondria determine burning. What determines growth? Insulin. Insulin is a hormone that is released from your pancreas, from the beta cells of your pancreas, in response to what you eat and how high your blood glucose goes, and it drives growth. It drives growth of muscle, it drives growth of other organs, and most importantly, it drives growth of fat tissue. We can't get away from the fact that 93% of Americans are metabolically ill. 93% of Americans have some form of metabolic dysfunction. And we can really translate that into mitochondrial dysfunction. 93% of the population has something wrong with their mitochondria. Now, ultimately, we have to make mitochondria work better if we're going to fix this chronic disease pandemic that has enveloped basically the entire Western world. How do you fix mitochondria? Well, first you have to know what's wrong with them. The thing that tells us that the mitochondria are dysfunctional is our fasting insulin. Our fasting insulin level is the closest method for determining mitochondrial dysfunction. And everyone should have a fasting insulin drawn with every yearly blood check. A fasting insulin tells you whether your mitochondria are working right, because if they are, then your fasting insulin is low, because that means that you are converting what you eat into energy and not storing it. And that's what you want. You want to turn it into energy, not fat cell growth. So keeping your fasting insulin down is job one. Now, a fasting insulin will tell you that, but in addition, there's a proxy that you don't have to go to your doctor for, and it is by measuring your glucose. Not your fasting glucose, because your body will do everything it can to keep your fasting glucose normal. That is, within the ranges of normality between 60 and 100 milligrams per DL. It's the last thing to change. Your fasting glucose does not tell you about metabolic dysfunction, but your glucose response to food is a proxy for insulin. So we learned earlier that high glucose causes endothelial cell dysfunction in the vasculature, leads to hypertension, leads to arteriosclerosis. So you want to keep the spike of glucose down, and also the length of time that the glucose stays elevated is a marker of insulin resistance. So the spike tells you about insulin release. The length tells you about insulin resistance. So by measuring your glucose in real time, over time, you can use that as a proxy for your metabolic health, even without a fasting insulin. How quickly can you fix your metabolism if you start adopting sensible dietary and exercise practices? We did a study at UCSF where we took 43 children with metabolic syndrome, and we took the sugar out of their diet and replaced it with an identical amount of starch. And we were able to show in 9 days an improvement in every metabolic marker. My colleagues at San Francisco General did the same essential study in adults, and they were able to document the same improvements in 2 weeks. We could see changes in sugar turning into fat in the liver. We could see changes in fasting insulin. In 10 days to 2 weeks, it doesn't take that long. So, within a month, you should be able to see significant changes in your metabolic parameters, and you should be able to tell within even a week to 2 weeks that you feel metabolically better. Now, the question is, how durable is it? How long will the effect last? The answer is, if you stop doing it, within 2 weeks, things will have gone back right to where you were at baseline. That's how quickly things can revert. But if you maintain that diet, if you maintain that exercise regimen, you should be able to see benefits 3 months, 6 months, a whole year out. And those will accumulate and extend life significantly. We have data to show that even 15 minutes of walking each day will extend lifespan by 3 years. And 30 minutes of exercise every other day will extend lifespan by 5 years. Glucose, you take it in from the outside in food, and it is substrate for both growth and burning. So you can use it to burn, you can use it to power the little energy burning factories inside each of your cells, the mitochondria, to make energy for the cell in the form of ATP, adenosine triphosphate, which is chemical energy that your body can use to power itself. Or you can turn glucose into building blocks of the cell so that the cell can grow and the cell can divide. So glucose can be turned into lipids for membranes. It can be turned into ribose for DNA. It can be turned into proteins for structural growth. Glucose does both. The question becomes, how does a cell know which one to do at any given time? What are the control mechanisms on any given cell at any moment? The glucose spike is due to your food. Air pollution doesn't cause a glucose spike. But the kind of food will determine the degree of the spike. And there are 2 reasons. One is the kind of glucose, and the other is the amount of fiber. So let's take each one individually. The kind of glucose. I just told you glucose is glucose. But in fact, polymerized glucose, called starch, has 2 forms. One is bread, rice, pasta, potatoes, called amylopectin, and the other one is beans, lentils, other legumes, called amylose. Amylopectin, amylose, they are not the same. Amylose, the brown food, if you will, is a string of glucoses, one end, one end. And the string is put together by bonds between the glucose molecules called alpha-1,4 bonds. Alpha-1,4 bonds they end up giving you a glucose response that is lower and slower. Amylopectin is branched. It's not a string. It's got branches. It's got alpha-1 4 bonds, but it also has alpha-1 6 bonds. It looks like a Christmas tree. And so enzymes can basically digest different glucoses off the tree, and so you can generate a much bigger and more rapid glucose response in your intestine, and therefore you will absorb more glucose faster. It will give you a bigger rise. Well, a bigger glucose rise ultimately means a bigger insulin rise too. So amylose has been shown to have beneficial effects in terms of keeping your insulin down. Amylopectin has been shown to increase the risk for an insulin rise. Now, this is captured through a phenomenon which we in nutrition call glycemic index. Glycemic index tells us how high will your blood glucose rise in that spike when you consume 50 grams of carbohydrate in a given food. So if you consume 50 grams of carbohydrate in bread, your glucose is going to go a lot higher than if you consume 50 grams of carbohydrate in beans. So bread, high glycemic index; beans, low glycemic index. Okay, now the second thing, fiber. The amount of fiber translates into slowing of that glucose absorption. So even if it's amylopectin, the presence of fiber in the food will act as a barrier. It forms a gel on the inside of your intestine, preventing glucose from actually being able to get into your bloodstream. So you will actually reduce the size of the spike by the presence of fiber. This concept of using fiber to reduce the size of the spike has a name also. It's called glycemic load. An example of this would be carrots. So carrots have a high glycemic index. If you eat 50 grams of carbohydrate in carrots, your blood glucose will go pretty high. But the question is not, what is the glycemic index of carrots? The question is, what is the glycemic load of carrots? Because in order to get 50 grams of carbohydrate in carrots, you have to eat 700 grams of carrots. You have to eat 1.4 pounds of carrots. Now, aside from Bugs Bunny, who's doing that? Nobody. And that's the point. So even though carrots have a high glycemic index, it has a low glycemic load. So amylose, fiber, both of them control the size of the glucose spike. And when you control the glucose spike, you're controlling the insulin spike. And when you control both of those, you are contributing to metabolic health. Your glucose changes during the course of the day. It's actually higher when you wake up because of growth hormone and cortisol being released while you sleep. It's about 5 to 7 points higher in the morning. We see this in diabetics. It's called the dawn phenomenon. Well, the dawn phenomenon occurs in non-diabetics too, because of growth hormone and cortisol release when you're waking in the morning. It's part of life. So measuring your blood glucose at 7 a.m. is not the same thing as measuring your blood glucose at 10 p.m. In addition, catching the rise and fall as you eat gives you all sorts of information about your insulin dynamics, whether or not your beta cells are making enough insulin and whether that insulin is working properly. And lastly, something else that's super important. When you clear your blood glucose from a meal, does the insulin hang around? Because if it hangs around, it's going to drive your blood glucose lower than baseline. And now you have something we call reactive hypoglycemia. And that makes you irritable and, most importantly, hungry. And so there's a really good chance you're going to reach for that chocolate chip cookie. Knowing that that happens to you is enormously important in terms of metabolic health and weight loss. Glucose is the energy of life. Glucose is part of sugar, it's part of starch. It's everywhere around us because every cell on the planet burns glucose for energy. Now, you eat a meal, you get a glucose load. That glucose gets absorbed from your intestine and goes straight to the liver. The liver takes about 20% of that glucose load and imports it into the liver directly. That leaves about 80% of the glucose out in the bloodstream to circulate, and that raises the serum glucose. You can measure that. You can measure it with finger sticks, you can measure it with a CGM. The point is, that glucose load is supplying substrate for either growth or burning to the rest of the body. 20% is going to your brain, and the rest is going to your heart, your kidneys, your muscles, any other organ that needs energy, which is all of them. That will raise your serum glucose, which you can measure. The cells will extract the glucose they need. The only cell that needs insulin to import that glucose is your fat cell. So whatever's left over, the insulin will clear and put into the fat cell for storage, because the rest of the body doesn't need the insulin to extract the glucose from the bloodstream. So a glucose spike, in essence, is your body's attempt to clear your meal. And every organ in your body will take what it needs, and only the fat cell will get the rest. And it gets that from insulin. The higher the spike, the more your rest of your body didn't get it. So the goal is keep the spikes low so that the rest of the body doesn't need the insulin in order to clear it. How many spikes are acceptable per day? And the answer is however many meals you eat. That's how many are acceptable, because you're going to get a spike every time you put food in your stomach. The question is, to what extent? The goal is to mitigate that spike as much as possible. If you eat foods that are low in refined carbohydrate, high in fiber, and low in leucine, then you should be able to keep your glucose spike and therefore your insulin spike relatively low. Optimally, you should probably only eat 2 meals a day, maybe 3 meals a day if you've got a family and you need it, but probably 2 meals a day will do it. We in America tend to eat 3, and is that part of the reason we have metabolic dysfunction? I don't think so, but some people have postulated that we don't need that 3rd meal. Maybe we don't need that 3rd glucose spike. Hard to know. We don't have good controls to answer the question. Ultimately, I don't care how many spikes you have, as long as you do whatever you can to mitigate the amplitude of the spike and the duration of the plateau. In other words, improve insulin release and improve insulin sensitivity. Get the insulin down any way you can. There's different information in the different components of the spike. it's not that the spike is worse than the plateau. It's not that the plateau is worse than the spike. They're telling you different things. The size, the amplitude of the initial spike is telling you what your insulin reserve is. So people with reduced insulin secretory capacity are going to have a bigger spike than people who can muster up a bigger insulin response. The plateau is going to tell you how insulin resistant are you. And that's going to tell you about your risk for all the other diseases of high insulin, termed metabolic syndrome. So not just diabetes, but fatty liver disease, hypertension, dyslipidemia, cardiovascular disease, cancer, dementia, polycystic ovarian disease are all dependent on that plateau. And what we've learned is that the spike, as the resistance gets worse and your beta cell starts running out of insulin, then the spike goes up. So in a sense, the plateau tends to precede the spike in terms of the evolution of the disease. So it's not really a question of which is worse, it's more of a question of what comes first. Eventually, if you've got a defective plateau because you're not clearing insulin, that means your beta cell is under strain. And ultimately, it will show up as a big spike at the beginning, and both are bad. When you consume a meal, you're going to overwhelm your body's blood glucose. It has to be cleared. So your pancreas is going to make insulin. Now, the insulin rise is going to clear that glucose. The question is, how much can you make and how quick does it work? The goal is, don't make so much and have it work great. The problem is, as you get older, as you get less fit, you're going to have to clear that glucose, and your beta cells may not be able to make enough, in which case you're not going to clear that glucose very quickly, and so the blood glucose will rise, so you will have a big glucose spike, and that will do damage to your vascular system. And as you get less fit, your insulin will work less well to drive that glucose out of your bloodstream. And that will mean that the glucose stays elevated for longer. That phenomenon of insulin not working as well, we call insulin resistance. So, two different phenomena. Insulin release can be compromised, and that will give you a high glucose spike, or insulin resistance, that will give you a long glucose plateau. Both are signs of metabolic dysfunction. Both lead to illness and death. Some people see that their blood glucose is lower in the morning and higher in the evening. You'd expect it to be the other way around. That may be due to changes in diurnal rhythms. It may be due to the food. If you are eating a high carbohydrate diet, then there's a very good chance that you are priming your beta cell as the day goes on. And so you're getting a bigger glucose spike. And because you're eating late instead of early, there should be at least 4 hours between the time you eat dinner and the time you go to sleep. If you're eating with less time between dinner and bedtime, then your glucose is going to be high, and that's going to end up driving energy into fat while you're sleeping, because the glucose still has to be cleared. And that's going to generate more insulin resistance. And that's going to show up throughout the entire day as a higher baseline. But in particular, because of the high carbohydrate meals, you will see a higher glucose at the end of the day. When you eat, your blood glucose rises. When the blood glucose clears, if your blood glucose goes below baseline, you kick out 3 hormones in order to raise your blood glucose back again. You kick out glucagon, you kick out epinephrine, and you kick out cortisol, all to make your blood glucose come back to baseline. The problem is you also got irritable and hungry. And so you eat on top of that. And so you've got these 3 hormones generating a glucose rise at the same time you're trying to fix it with food. And so you get a bigger response, which then the insulin will come and knock back down, and you may yet get another reactive hypoglycemia again, and so you may kick your glucagon, your epinephrine, and your cortisol back in a second time, and so now you have a glucose roller coaster because of the counter-regulatory hormones that your body made in response to your glucose going down below baseline, all because of the food you ate. We now have a fair amount of data, and what we've learned is that in response to a mixed meal, because that's what people eat, they don't just consume glucose, what we've seen is that the rise will occur within the first 30 to 45 minutes, depending, and it should fall again around 75 to 90 minutes. If your blood glucose has returned to baseline by 90 minutes, you are doing pretty well. If, on the other hand, it is still high at 120 minutes, you are not doing as well. And the other thing you need to watch for is this reactive hypoglycemia, and that tends to center around 75 minutes. So if your blood glucose goes below baseline at 75 minutes, check to see how you feel when you get that number, and see if that is below baseline, and see if you feel irritable, tired, hungry. Because if that's the case, that means that your insulin response is greater than your need, because it is sticking around and driving your glucose lower, which means you probably need a change in the carbohydrate or the fiber you're eating. So remember, there are 2 parts to the insulin excursion. There's the initial rise or the spike, and then there's the second phase or the plateau. That rise can be mitigated by reducing total carbohydrate and increasing fiber. The plateau can be mitigated by improving insulin sensitivity, that is, reducing refined carbohydrate and sugar. So either way, fixing your diet will fix the insulin excursion, both parts of it, the spike and the plateau. Get the sugar down, get the carbohydrate down, get the insulin down, and you will improve metabolic health. You will improve mitochondrial functioning. You will improve your health and your longevity. So what should your average glucose level be? The fact is, there is no average level glucose because it's in constant fluctuation, because you're always either preprandial or postprandial, except when you're asleep. Now, when you're asleep, your average glucose should be somewhere between 60 and 80. When you're awake, it kind of depends on what you're doing, and it also depends on what you're eating, and it depends on how insulin sensitive you are. And it depends on how much stress you're under. And it depends on the last cup of coffee you drank. So it's actually kind of hard to get specific numbers. Having said that, the American Diabetes Association says that if your fasting blood glucose is over 90, it's an issue. If it's over 100, you have prediabetes. And if it's over 125, you actually have type 2 diabetes. If your postprandial, 2-hour postprandial blood sugar is over 140, you have prediabetes. And if your postprandial blood sugar is over 200, you have frank type 2 diabetes. What I care about is you getting your blood glucose as low as possible because you got your insulin as low as possible. If you become insulin sensitive, your glucose will take care of itself. That's where you start. And to be honest with you, that's where you finish. But how do you get there? CGM is the best way today to get there. So what should your fasting glucose be? Well, it should be probably between 70 and 85. Optimally, maybe 70 to 90. Suboptimally, how high should it go after you've eaten? Probably shouldn't go above 110. If it goes above 120 and turns around quickly, not so bad. Ultimately, the goal is to get back to baseline within 90 minutes. That's more important than how high it goes, because that's the plateau. If you're seeing it go further than that, that's the sign of insulin resistance. That tells you you've got metabolic dysfunction. Mitochondrial dysfunction translates into insulin resistance. Insulin resistance translates into hyperinsulinemia. Hyperinsulinemia translates into chronic metabolic disease. So you can draw a direct line between the mitochondria and your health. Insulin resistance is the first sign of the problem. That's telling you that you've got a problem. You can see it in the plateau. Eventually, you'll see it in the fasting insulin. So, without question, a continuous glucose monitor will pick up metabolic dysfunction before any of our other laboratory biomarkers do. One of the reasons for choosing and wearing a continuous glucose monitor is to look at that insulin plateau, because that is the first sign that your metabolism has a problem, that things are going south. Insulin drives defective cell growth. It causes cells to grow when they shouldn't. Certainly it causes fat cells to grow, but it also causes vascular smooth muscle to grow. It causes glandular tissue to grow. It causes changes in the brain that prevent utilization of glucose because of insulin resistance, which ultimately lead to defective ATP generation. That's one of the reasons why Alzheimer's disease has been called diabetes type 3. But we know that insulin resistance is a primary driver of defective CNS glucose utilization. So getting your insulin down is job one. It is the most important thing to improve your metabolic health. And continuous glucose monitoring will pick up the first signs of that metabolic dysfunction before any of our other biomarkers can. So that's where the rubber hits the road. Insulin is a hormone. It is released by the pancreas, the beta cells of the pancreas, which lives behind your stomach, and it responds to the glucose rise in your bloodstream when you eat. Where does that glucose go? Well, it goes to the various cells of the body, but primarily the excess will go to fat. And so insulin will drive the growth of the fat depot. So more insulin, more fat. Insulin is the control mechanism by which cells turn from burning and toward growth. And it makes sense that that would be the case, because when you have excess energy, when you have excess glucose, you're going to do something to turn that into growth. So one of the linchpins between growth and burning is the level of the hormone insulin. Insulin is always good and bad. Insulin is never good or bad. It's always good and bad. It's good because it clears the glucose from the bloodstream. Because glucose in the bloodstream does its own damage. It causes endothelial cell dysfunction. It causes the cells lining the inside of your arteries to be dysfunctional. One of the reasons for arteriosclerosis, one of the reasons for hypertension. You've got to get the glucose out of the bloodstream. Think of it. A standard blood glucose is about 80 milligrams per deciliter. That's how it's reported. If you figure out your total blood volume of 6 liters, that means you have about 5 grams of glucose in your bloodstream when you are fasting. 1 teaspoonful. When you consume an orange juice, you have consumed about 9 times the amount of glucose that you have in your entire bloodstream. Your body has to do something to clear that before it does damage. And that's the role of insulin. Insulin clears that glucose before it does damage. The problem is that the insulin molecule itself does damage because it causes the coronary arteries to grow, it causes the vascular smooth muscle in your heart and in the rest of your vascular system to grow, it causes glandular tissue to grow, it causes all sorts of things to grow. And when they grow, they risk cancer, they risk clotting, and they risk degeneration. So growth is good when you're a kid. It's not so good when you're an adult. So keeping that growth signal down is a primary directive, and insulin's working against you as you get older. Insulin is a growth factor. Insulin makes cells grow and divide. There is no growth without insulin. Now, if you're a kid and you're growing, if you're in puberty and you're growing, if you're pregnant and you're growing, you need more insulin. So the phenomenon of insulin resistance, that is, insulin working less well, is necessary to drive all of that growth because you need a high insulin level. But if you're laying down fat, that's the wrong thing to be doing with your energy, to be turning it into fat. That's the growth you don't want. But insulin is going to drive that growth. So if you're consuming excess, or if you're consuming things that drive insulin, like refined carbohydrate and sugar, you're going to lay down more fat. And the higher your insulin goes, the more fat you're going to lay down. Worse yet, that fat then releases proteins that feed back on the liver and make your insulin work even less well. And now you've got insulin resistance, and you're going to drive even more insulin up and more fat gain. So you get caught in this vicious cycle of more insulin, more fat, more insulin, more fat. And you can't get the fat down until you get the insulin down. So fixing the insulin resistance is job one. Insulin is constantly pushing on your fat cell, saying, store more energy, store more energy. We have to turn that around. We have to get the fat cell to give up energy in order to be able to lose weight. But in the face of a high insulin, it can't be done. The only way to get a fat cell to give up its energy is to get the insulin level down any way you can. The easiest way is diet. The second easiest way is exercise. There is no weight loss until insulin declines. You have to get your insulin down in order to be able to lose weight. Otherwise, that insulin is just going to keep pushing on your fat and making it grow even more. Insulin reduction is absolutely required for weight loss, period. And every weight loss modality that works gets insulin down. Inflammation is essential. Inflammation keeps us healthy because it clears out foreign invaders and it allows for us to clear damage and heal. That's all part of the process of inflammation. You can't do without it. But mostly, inflammation tends to be local. So, you sprain your ankle, you get inflammation because you have to clear damaged tissue and you have to heal. You cut yourself shaving, you're going to get inflammation because you have to clear damaged tissue and you have to heal. Wound healing is the end product of inflammation. It's essential. All of those are acute inflammatory responses, and all of those are localized. And that's good. But there's other inflammation. There's inflammation that's whole body inflammation, like, for instance, when you get a virus. The goal is raise the body temperature to kill the bacteria or kill the virus, try to activate those white blood cells to clear whatever the infection is. You're doing damage, but ultimately you are healing. But there is something called chronic inflammation, where you don't solve the problem. You don't clear the damage. You don't get the healing because the inflammation is unrelenting. It continues because the offending agent hasn't been dealt with, because you are in constant, unending exposure. The only way to stop it is to stop the exposure. So what is the exposure that causes chronic inflammation? Well, many things. They're all in the environment. Air pollution causes chronic inflammation. We know that people who live closer to freeways have more risk for diabetes and more risk for cancer than people who don't, because they are breathing an inflammatory particle. What about the rest of us? Our gut. Our gut is the source of the chronic inflammation, and the reason is because of our diet, because that intestinal barrier has been perturbed, because it's not blocking the junk from getting into the bloodstream. In the same way, our lungs are not stopping the junk from getting into our bloodstream. Ultimately, if you have chronic inflammation, you're going to generate cytokines, you're going to generate heat, you're going to generate the aging reaction, you're going to generate cortisol, and you're going to generate early death. That's what inflammation does. And the only way we know how to stop inflammation is get rid of the exposure. So, you can't do very much about your air, except move. But you can do a whole lot about your diet. So, we have things in our diet that are pro-inflammatory, and we have things in our diet that are anti-inflammatory. Pro-inflammatory foods are things that generate an immune response. Like what? Well, things that have omega-6 fatty acids, okay? Seed oils. And the reason is because omega-6s are the precursor of a fatty acid called arachidonic acid, and arachidonic acid is the precursor to all of the inflammatory molecules, thromboxanes, leukotrienes, eicosanoids, basically causing inflammation. Where do you get seed oils from? Ultra-processed food, because we're talking soybean oil, we're talking corn oil, we're talking even canola oil. We're talking about the oils that the food industry specifically uses because they increase shelf life and because they're cheap. Now, are there other pro-inflammatory foods? Absolutely. Sugar is a pro-inflammatory item. And the reason is because of that fructose molecule. Glucose is not pro-inflammatory, but fructose is. Why? Because fructose causes changes in the microbiome that cause the bacteria in your microbiome to chew up that mucin layer, thus exposing your intestine to all of the junk that can get into your bloodstream. Fructose nitrates those tight junctions, rendering them permeable so that stuff can get through. And finally, fructose knocks off those immunologic cells, allowing for bacteria, whole bacteria, to be able to pass through into the bloodstream because we can measure them. So, sugar is a pro-inflammatory substrate. So, seed oils, sugar. Sounds like ultra-processed food to me. All right, what are anti-inflammatory foods? Anti-inflammatory foods are foods that suppress that immune response. And I can sum that up with 3 items. The first, fiber. Now, how can fiber be an anti-inflammatory food when we don't even digest it or absorb it? Because fiber is the food for your bacteria. It is the food for your microbiome. It's what your microbiome chews up. And if you don't feed your microbiome will feed on you. That's how you lose your mucin layer. So when you consume fiber, that is whole food that hasn't had the fiber stripped from it, you will be actually supporting your microbiome. And we know that because your microbiome will turn that fiber into a compound called short-chain fatty acids. Acetate, propionate, butyrate. And butyrate has very specifically been shown to reduce intestinal inflammation, reduce the transit of bad stuff into the bloodstream, reduce systemic inflammation, reduce Alzheimer's disease. Bottom line, fiber is the nutrient for your bacteria, and you have to feed your gut, and we're not. Second, omega-3 fatty acids. Omega-3 fatty acids do the opposite of omega-6 fatty acids. They are the precursor to DHA, docosahexaenoic acid, which is necessary for neurotransmission and for immune health, and also EPA, eicosapentaenoic acid, which is also necessary for good brain function. And finally, ALA, alpha-linolenic acid, which has cardiovascular protective effects. So, where do you get omega-3s from? Well, you can get ALA from fruits and vegetables, but EPA and DHA need marine life. We need fish, okay? And it's not because the fish make the omega-3s, the fish eat the omega-3s. What makes the omega-3s? The algae. The fish eat the algae, we eat the fish. We get our omega-3s third hand. Problem is, there isn't enough good wild fish to go around. And so, omega-3s are a prime directive to metabolic health. And then lastly, the third anti-inflammatory food is vitamin D. Vitamin D suppresses something called the toll-like receptors that keep inflammation in check. And so by maintaining a check on inflammation, we can keep the inflammatory cascade from burgeoning out of control and causing all this excess damage. So, omega-3s, vitamin D, fiber. Sounds like real food to me. Inflammation is another control mechanism of the body. So, of course, our body is our temple, but our temple sometimes gets invaded by foreign invaders, and the goal is to clear those foreign invaders out. We have several pathways in our body to generate inflammation, ways to stop foreign invaders, bacteria, viruses, fungi, parasites. Inflammation is essential to life. You can't live if you don't generate a good inflammatory response. So, you need inflammation, but inflammation turns your body away from growth and toward burning. You increase your burning rate, and the reason we know that is because you increase your body temperature. How else can you generate an increased body temperature unless you're burning at a higher rate? The difference is you're not making ATP out of it. You're just making body heat. Now, that's great for trying to fight off the invader. It's not great for you. It's a source of aging, and it's a source of early death. So we have to control inflammation. So the question is, where's the inflammation coming from? Now, if you have an autoimmune disease, it's coming from your immune system recognizing something as foreign. But, you know, only about 1 in 10 people have an autoimmune disease, yet 9 out of 10 people have inflammation. So where's the rest of the inflammation coming from? It's coming from the gut. It's coming from your intestine. It's coming from where the bacteria are. And the bacteria are all throughout your intestine. Your intestine is a sewer. It's a pipe with junk in it. And that junk makes inflammatory cytokines, it makes lipopolysaccharides, it makes stuff that is bad for you. And it needs to stay in the intestine. So your intestine has developed 3 barriers to keep the junk where it belongs. It has a physical barrier called the mucin layer, which lines all the intestinal cells to keep the junk inside, not in your bloodstream. It has a biochemical barrier called tight junctions to keep each of the cells approximated so that junk can't get through. And finally, it has an immunological barrier to basically kill off any bacteria that might venture through the barrier and try to get into the bloodstream. All 3 of those barriers are under attack today. And so we, Americans, and really pretty much anybody who eats the Western diet, is inflamed because of their gut, because of their diet. In order to fix that inflammation, in order to be able to utilize energy for either burning or growth instead of just heat, we need to fix our inflammation. As people age, the vicissitudes of life tend to catch up with you. The cortisol bumps from all the chronic stress that we're all under, the ultra-processed food that we're all exposed to, the air pollution, the obesogens in our environment, in the vinyl flooring, in the cosmetics. I mean, basically, we are under constant onslaught by various chemicals that interfere with our ability to burn and grow. As that happens, we're going to lose that growth signal, and so muscle starts to decline as you get older. One way to keep that up is, of course, exercise. But the natural event is for muscle mass to decrease as one gets older because of all of this onslaught. Well, that's one less place for glucose to go. So when you eat a sizable portion, up to sometimes 70 to 75% of a glucose load will end up in your muscle to power the muscles of your body. If you lose that muscle, where does the glucose go? Well, it stays in your bloodstream, and now your insulin has to clear it into fat. So that's going to put an increased strain on your beta cells, because they're going to have to make more insulin to generate an increased storage place in your fat for all of that now excess glucose that wasn't excess before, but is now. And so you tend to lose muscle, gain fat as you get older. In addition, as you get older, growth hormone decreases. So growth hormone is one of the things that helps you build muscle. It's one of the things that makes you grow. It's growth hormone. Well, growth hormone has a life cycle, and it peaks at around 17 to 25 and then starts to go down as you get older. As you lose sex hormones as you get older, your growth hormone goes even lower. And so that stimulus to make muscle is now resolving, and what takes its place is fat. So basically you've got less opportunity to be able to burn the energy and more laying down of fat. This, of course, creates even more insulin resistance. That puts a greater strain on those beta cells, which are also losing capacity because of all those chronic exposures. And so they cannot keep up with the increased need for clearance peripherally. And so eventually you'll get to the point where you just don't have enough insulin for the way your body has changed. One of the biggest issues facing women today is what to do about menopause. Menopause is part of life. Menopause is the natural evolution of ovaries. Some people earlier, some people later, but eventually ovaries burn out. And when they burn out, the estrogen that they made basically goes down to zero. And that has all sorts of ramifications for metabolism throughout the body, especially in the brain. The drop in estrogen changes the sympathetic nervous system to generate heat. And so you get these hot flashes, and they feel awful because the sympathetic nervous system, which was under suppression by estrogen, is now basically released from it. And so you get all sorts of, unpleasant and unwanted side effects from the drop in estrogen. Now, one of the other problems is that women premenopausally have low serum LDL and triglycerides, but after menopause, their LDL and triglycerides rise. And no one's sure why that is. But that puts women at increased risk for cardiovascular events later on in life. They are protected from heart attacks prior to menopause, but they catch up after menopause. So controlling that LDL and triglyceride rise that occurs after menopause is a high priority. Estrogen is also responsible for growth hormone release. And so when estrogen declines, growth hormone goes down, and so women lose muscle the same as men. And when muscle is lost, it is often replaced as fat. So all of these phenomena are conspiring to basically destroy women's healthy metabolism as they pass through menopause. The good news is that most of them are remediable with both changes in diet and improved exercise. When you exercise, you activate the sympathetic nervous system. Now, the sympathetic nervous system is the part of your nervous system that is the fight or flight response. In the process, the sympathetic nervous system will activate and will send nervous impulses to the liver. The liver will then release all of the stored up glucose that it has in the form of glycogen. Glycogen is what you make in response to eating a meal, especially a high carbohydrate meal, glucose for a rainy day. This is why marathoners carb load before a race, because they're trying to build up their liver glycogen stores so that they can release them during the race. So when you start exercising, your liver will take that glycogen and turn it into glucose and release it into the bloodstream. That will lead to a rise in your serum glucose. That will lead to a glucose spike. And then that glucose is now available for muscles, for the brain, for the kidneys, to be able to metabolize energy while you are exercising. And it will stay up until either the liver runs out of glycogen, which takes about 3 hours, or until you stop exercising. In either case, your glucose will then fall precipitously. So, if you stop exercising, you will clear that glucose spike very rapidly. If you are on the football gridiron and exercising like crazy, your glucose will start falling precipitously, and you will all of a sudden become very tired because you have run out of readily available glucose. This is one reason why the sports drink companies put fructose into the sports drinks, because that's another way to generate glucose when you're exercising. And it's true. If you are a gridiron athlete, an elite athlete, that fructose in that sports drink will ultimately get converted back into glucose and will help replete the glycogen that your liver has lost. No one else needs the fructose for anything else. But the bottom line is you will clear the glucose spike rapidly because you have stopped exercising. What happens to your glucose when you enter a sauna? The heat is a stress. The stress activates the sympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system goes to your liver and causes glycogen to be released, and so it will generate a glucose spike all by itself with having eaten nothing. Just from the epinephrine being released, it will cause a glucose rise. That glucose will clear quickly because your insulin will come up to meet it and it will go away. It will have caused no damage and will be gone very quickly. But that's also one of the reasons why after you've been in the sauna, you want to go take a nap afterwards. It's because you have actually depleted some of your glucose stores and you need time to replete them. So enjoy your nap. We've gotten sick in the last 50 years because of the changes in our environment. And our environment has changed in multitudinous ways. Our diets changed, our sleep cycles changed, our capacity and opportunities for exercise have changed, our stress has changed, our exposure to toxins has changed. Bottom line, in order to achieve optimal metabolic health, we have to work in every single one of those venues. How do we do that? Well, we can't. We can't fix them all. But there are certain ones that we can, okay? And the one that's immediately available and the one you can fix today is your diet. And the data show that if you fix your diet, your improvement in cardiovascular mortality risk is dropped by 35 to 40%. Now, compare that to if all of a sudden you started exercising. Now that's also good, but the data show that if you start exercising, your improvement in cardiometabolic mortality risk reduces by a total of 25%. Which is better, 35 to 40% or 25%? Both good, do both. But if you had to do one thing, make it diet. Because number one, you have complete control, and number two, you can make your own food. And number three, it works best. It's not a shocker that adults and children today are getting less sleep than they did before. In fact, 35% of adults get less than 7 hours of sleep per night, and 23% of adults are chronic insomniacs. And the question is, what does that do to your metabolic health? And the answer is, it does two things, both bad. The first is, it's a stress. It raises your cortisol. And we've already talked about cortisol being a mitochondrial dissociator. It basically creates heat instead of creating ATP. That's bad for your metabolic health because now your cells are basically running on empty. No wonder you feel lousy. Second, sleep deprivation increases a hormone that is responsible for hunger, which comes from the stomach, called ghrelin. Ghrelin is released in response to sleep deprivation, circulates in the bloodstream, goes to your brain and says, I'm hungry, feed me. And so you end up eating more, which will only raise your glucose excursions and your insulin response and generate increased fat and, of course, chronic metabolic disease. So chronic sleep deprivation affects cortisol, driving metabolic dysfunction, and ghrelin, driving increased eating. Everyone thinks that, oh, I'm eating more because I'm up longer. No, you're eating more because your ghrelin is dysfunctional. So how do you fix sleep deprivation? Well, one way is cut the caffeine, because caffeine is exactly what's wrong with sleep, but that's not the only thing. The other thing to do is take the screens out of your bedroom. Studies show that children who sleep with their phones charging in their bedroom get 28 minutes less sleep per night than children whose screens are charging outside their bedroom. The blue light by itself alters the diurnal rhythms of the brain, ultimately leading to metabolic dysfunction. So, sleep deprivation, stress reduction, all part and parcel of the same metabolic toxic mix. So, does sleep affect your CGM? And the answer is, at levels we've shown that the more sleep people get, the more time in range, and the lower the glucose excursions that we see. More sleep, more better from a glucose standpoint. Cortisol is the stress hormone. It is made by the adrenal gland, and it circulates in the bloodstream. And what it does is it raises the serum glucose in order to provide more energy for the brain so that the brain can still run even when there's no glucose available. And also, it will start actually taking away from muscle. It will actually cause the dissolution of muscle in order to keep the brain fed. So, chronic stress is the opposite of acute stress in terms of the physiology and in terms of the glucose requirement. The goal of chronic stress is to feed the brain, because the brain is the highest glucose demander. It requires the most glucose all the time because it doesn't have a place to store glucose. So cortisol lifts energy from the rest of the body and makes sure that the brain gets it. Well, that has negative effects on the brain, and it also has negative effects on that glucose excursion, because glucocorticoids actually interfere with mitochondria and interfere with the ability to produce ATP in many of those organs. And so cortisol dissociates the energy availability from the energy utilization. It actually inhibits mitochondrial function. And so the higher the cortisol, the bigger the glucose rise, but the less well you're going to clear it. Because glucose interferes with mitochondria, you see the effect as insulin resistance. In fact, the more stressed you are, the higher your fasting insulin, because the less well your mitochondria are working. And the only way to fix that is fix the stress. Now, that's pretty hard to do. Now there's protein. So protein is the macronutrient of the moment. Everybody's really excited about protein. And the reason that they're excited about protein is because of new data that shows that muscle loss leads to metabolic syndrome, declining health, and early death. No question, sarcopenia is a bad guy in the story. And as we said, aging is a driver of sarcopenia. And without question, protein is necessary to mitigate that risk. But it's not just protein, it's protein plus exercise. You cannot turn protein into muscle unless you exercise as well. So, what if you just consume protein? That's all. And the answer is, protein will lower the glucose rise. One reason it will lower the glucose rise is because protein is mixed in all the other food, and so it presents a competitor to glucose absorption, so it keeps the glucose in the lumen longer because of the gamish of the various nutrients within the chyme, within the digested food, as opposed to, say, a soft drink where it gets absorbed super easy and super rapidly. So it will keep the glucose rise down for that reason, but it'll also keep the glucose rise down for a different reason, which is maybe not so good. So protein, as you may know, have 20 amino acids that compose the different proteins that we consume. 9 of those amino acids are called essential amino acids. You have to consume them, your body can't make them. And you have to get those 9 essential amino acids. One of those amino acids that's essential is called leucine. Leucine is very high in milk, and it's very high in corn. And leucine, of all the other amino acids, is the one that goes to the beta cell and stimulates insulin by itself without glucose. So we always talk about glucose being the stimulus to insulin release. Yes, but leucine is a stimulator of insulin release as well. So when you consume high doses of leucine in the form of corn-fed beef, chicken, and fish, or in the form of milk, you will generate a greater insulin response, which will keep your glucose spike lower, because after all, insulin's clearing glucose from the circulation. So that sounds like a good thing, but as we've talked about, that insulin rise is part of the problem because it's driving growth when you want burning. And so, in a sense, it's making your cell be dysynchronous with the food load that it is dealing with. So, while keeping the glucose down is essential and the whole reason for wearing a CGM, the goal is to keep the insulin down. And leucine makes the insulin go up. And then finally, there's fat, dietary fat. And that's really complicated. And the reason is because there are 7 different fats, and they all do different things. And 3 of them are good for you, and 3 of them are a little less good for you, and 1 of them is downright poison. So we have to discuss each one because people want to know. All right, what are the good for you ones? Omega-3s. Omega-3s are the single best thing you can put in your body. Omega-3s, as we've talked about, you can find in certain vegetables and in marine life. Omega-3s are heart-healthy, anti-inflammatory, anti-Alzheimer's, and our current omega-3 consumption is way low. Number 2, monounsaturated fatty acids, oleic acid. This is what's in olive oil. Olive oil is a winner, and the reason is because olive oil stimulates the liver to produce a transcription factor which helps total body metabolism. And that's a good thing. The only bad thing about olive oil is if you heat it too high, because the double bond in olive oil that makes it a monounsaturated fatty acid can flip, and when you put heat across it. And if it flips, now you have a trans fat, which is the worst. Number 3, polyunsaturated fatty acids. Walnut oils and various other nut oils are polyunsaturated. They are also good. They also will keep your LDL down. They will keep your membranes intact in good ways. But like olive oil, if you put enough heat across those double bonds, they will flip and you will get trans fats. And because there are more double bonds, more risk for it. Number 4, saturated fat. Now everybody thinks saturated fat is bad because they've been told for 50 years that saturated fat is the bad guy. No, saturated fat is cardiovascularly neutral. It's neither good nor bad. It doesn't have any double bonds, so you can heat it to any level you want and it won't change its structure because there's no double bond to break or to flip. It is not necessarily good for you, but dairy-saturated fats have a phospholipid signature which actually is associated with metabolic health, prevention of cardiovascular disease and diabetes. So dairy-saturated fat and red meat-saturated fat aren't even the same. Number 5, medium-chain triglycerides. Now they're also very hot because number 1, the vegans love it because they're not animal fat, things like coconut oil, and the paleo people love it because it fits within the paleo diet. And for the most part, they tend to be reasonably good too, unless you mix them with a whole lot of saturated fat, in which case you end up with a whole lot of triglyceride being manufactured in the liver, which is not so good. Number 6, omega-6 fatty acids. These are the seed oils, the soybean oil, the cottonseed oil, the corn oil, etc. And those are the precursors of arachidonic acid and therefore the precursors to inflammation. And so they drive inflammation and you want to try to keep those down. And they are in virtually every ultra-processed food. And then finally, number 7, trans fats, which are the devil incarnate. And the reason is because we don't have the enzyme to break that trans double bond. Well, the reason they were put into the food in the first place was because the bacteria don't have that enzyme either. They can't chew them up. They can't make trans fat laden food rancid vis-a-vis the 10-year-old Twinkie. And so virtually every baked good prior to 2000 had a multitude of trans fats. Well, they were lining our arteries and our livers and causing metabolic syndrome and early demise. So what does dietary fat do to your CGM reading? Well, it depends. Depends on what exactly you're eating. If you are eating straight fat, like a ketogenic diet, your serum glucose should vary almost not at all. And the reason is because fat does not stimulate glucose. It does not stimulate insulin. However, what fat does is it primes the beta cell to release more insulin in response to glucose. So if you eat fat and glucose together, i.e. Cinnabon, the fat's going to prime the beta cell to release more insulin in response to that glucose rise than it would have otherwise. So even though it didn't change the glucose response, it sure as L changed the insulin response. And you will get a bigger insulin response because the fat was paired with sugar. And that's pretty much true for fat in virtually any carbohydrate. So, in and of itself, fat is not a stimulator of glucose rise or insulin rise, but because it primes the beta cell, it generates an increased insulin response, which is not good from a metabolic standpoint. Fiber is the stealth nutrient. Fiber is your friend. Fiber is probably the most important nutrient you don't absorb. Okay? For years, fiber wasn't even a nutrient because you didn't absorb it. The FDA finally made a change and said, yes, we do need fiber in our diet. And they set a minimum amount of 25 grams per day. The median for America right now is 12 grams per day. We all probably should be getting about 50 grams per day. All right, that gives you some idea about where we are. We're getting about 1/4 of what we need and about 1/2 of what is at least rational. Now, why is fiber so important? Fiber does 6 things that all improve metabolic health. The first thing it does, it gives some bulk. It gives a mechanical stretching to the stomach, which gives you a feeling of fullness, reducing total food intake. Number 2, the insoluble fiber, the cellulose, forms a lattice work like a fishnet on the inside of your intestine. The soluble fiber, the pectins, the inulin, like what holds jelly together, are globular. They plug the holes in the fishnet, and together they form a gel, a whitish gel, and you can see it on electron microscopy, coating the inside of your small intestine and generating a secondary barrier. And that secondary barrier prevents the transport of glucose and fructose and sucrose and starches from the intestine into the bloodstream, thus keeping your blood glucose down, which you measure in your CGM. Well, that keeps your insulin down. And so that's good for your metabolic health because it's all about getting that insulin down. Third thing, the food doesn't get absorbed early, so it moves through the intestine where the microbiome lives, and it will chew it up for its own purposes. So you are feeding the gut. And when you feed the gut, then your intestine bacteria don't have to chew on the mucin layer that's protecting it. Number 4, it greases the skids and moves the food through the intestine faster. This is why fiber laxatives exist, is to prevent constipation because it carries water with it and moves the food through the intestine faster. Well, that generates the satiety signal at the end of the intestine sooner, so you won't eat that second portion. Number 5, the soluble fiber in what you eat serves as food for the colonic bacteria, which will turn that into short-chain fatty acids, acetate, propionate, butyrate, which are anti-inflammatory, help prevent irritable bowel syndrome, and prevent Alzheimer's disease. And finally, the insoluble fiber acts like little scrubbies on the inside of the colon, basically sloughing off colon cancer cells so that you don't get colon cancer. So the amount of fiber you consume is inversely correlated with your risk for colon cancer. So every single thing fiber does improves your metabolic health. And the way it shows up is in the reduction in the glucose response on CGM. In fact, a high fiber diet will give you the glucose response of a ketogenic diet. And a ketogenic diet is the one that suppresses insulin the most. Any food that came out of the ground has fiber because that's what allows the food to get out of the ground. So fiber is in fruits. Yes, fructose is in fruits too, but the fiber reduces the absorption. And so it makes that fructose less of a burden and safe. Fiber is in vegetables. Stringy vegetables, not as much for starchy vegetables, green vegetables. And of course, if you eat green vegetables, you're going to get all those antioxidants also, which are good for you as well, because they're going to take care of the reactive oxygen species we spoke about earlier. Animal products do not have fiber, contrary to popular opinion. So you have to basically restrict yourself to produce. Now, does bread have fiber? And the answer is very few. Some breads do, because they're made from grain, and wheat has fiber until the mill takes it away. So if you take a wheat berry and you measure the weight of the husk, which is the fiber, against the weight of the endosperm, which is the starch in the center, turns out the fiber is 25% of the kernel. 25%. So in order to find a high fiber bread, you have to look at the total carbohydrate to dietary fiber ratio on the side of the package, and you have to do the calculation yourself, because they're not going to do it for you. If the total carbohydrate to fiber ratio is 3:1 to 5:1, then that is a high fiber bread. And that is a bread worth eating for its metabolic benefits. Anything above that means that the fiber has been stripped out. And even if they call it a high fiber bread, it's not. Even if they call it a whole grain bread, it's not. Because they can call it whole grain if they started with whole grain before they did the pulverization and got rid of the husk. So just because it's brown doesn't make it good. You actually have to look at the fiber content of the bread. So, what breads are high fiber breads? You can go to Whole Foods or to specialty grocery stores and look for German fitness bread as an example. So this is bread that is a pound, but it is like a brick. It's thin and it's small and it is dense. It has very high fiber. It's cut very thin, and it makes a really lousy sandwich. And the reason is because there's not that much gluten in it to hold it together. If you go to the grocery store, the breads are twice or to 4 times the size. They're all puffed up. Those are high gluten breads. They make a terrific sandwich, but they have all had their fiber stripped out, and they all have carbohydrate to fiber ratios of 8:1 to 10:1. Those are the breads that are not metabolically worth eating. There are 262 names for sugar. 262. And the reason is because the food industry likes it that way, because they can use a different name for sugar on the side of the package, and a different sugar can be number 5, number 6, number 7, number 8, number 9, and when you add it up, it's number 1. They hide it in plain sight. But virtually every one of those 262, it's because of the fructose. That's the problem. So what is glucose and what is fructose? And while we're at it, what is sucrose and high fructose corn syrup? 2. Glucose is what plants make in starch. Fructose is what plants make in sugar. Starch, not sweet. Sugar, sweet. Glucose, not very sweet. Fructose, very sweet. Fructose is addictive because fructose stimulates the reward center of the brain and tells you, this feels good, I want more. In the same way cocaine, heroin, nicotine, and alcohol do. And it makes sense because fructose and alcohol are metabolized the same way, do the same things metabolically in the body and also centrally in the brain. Fructose and alcohol both lead to Alzheimer's disease. Fructose is half of sucrose, half of dietary sugar, half of high fructose corn syrup, half of maple syrup, honey, agave. If it's sweet and it's, quote, natural, It's fructose. That's the way it works. Fructose has metabolic detriments that glucose does not. Glucose stimulates mitochondria to work better. Fructose inhibits mitochondria from working better. Fructose inhibits 3 enzymes involved in mitochondrial function. I'll name them real quick: AMP kinase, ACAD-L, and CPT1. Bottom line, fructose inhibits mitochondrial function. Fructose inhibits ATP generation. Fructose inhibits energy metabolism. Fructose makes you sick. The goal is keep the fructose down. How do you do that? Well, get rid of the dietary sugar. The problem is there are 262 names for them, and the food industry uses them all. So, until we have policies that address this issue in Washington and London and throughout the world, you have to be on your guard. Another problem with fructose is it's not measured by the CGM. So, glucose is monitored by the CGM, fructose is not. So when you consume something with a lot of sugar, your CGM will rise because of the glucose, but you won't even see the contribution of the fructose because it's not being picked up by the CGM. But because fructose does all of these things that glucose doesn't, it's 7 times worse, and you don't even measure it on the CGM. So, absolutely essential to try to keep your dietary sugar consumption low. How low? Well, how about 0? No one needs it. There is no biochemical reaction in any vertebrate organism that requires dietary fructose. How's that? Now, we can tolerate a certain amount, up to about 25 grams of sugar, therefore 12 grams of fructose per day. That would be 6 teaspoons of added sugar per day. An orange juice is 11 teaspoons. A Milky Way bar is 7 teaspoons. A bowl of Fruit Loops is 4 teaspoons. So you can see it adds up pretty fast. Bottom line is, if you want dessert, have dessert. Just don't eat dessert for breakfast, lunch, dinner, and snacks. Fructose is a metabolic toxin, in the same way alcohol is a metabolic toxin. And it makes sense that it should be, because after all, where do we get alcohol from? Fermentation of fructose. It's called wine. We do it in Napa and Sonoma every day. The big difference between the two is that for alcohol, the yeast does the first step of metabolism, which is called glycolysis. For fructose, we do our own first step. After that, they're virtually identical. In the same way that alcohol causes metabolic damage, fructose causes metabolic damage. One of those ways is through a compound made in the liver called uric acid. Now, uric acid is a bad guy in the story. Uric acid is one cause, not the only, but one cause of hypertension, high blood pressure. Uric acid blocks an enzyme in your blood vessels that relax your blood vessels called nitric oxide. Uric acid reduces nitric oxide. Well, fructose metabolism leads to uric acid. And uric acid is a bad guy in this story. So, uric acid also inhibits mitochondrial function. It also generates increased fat in the liver, and it increases blood pressure. Fructose is a driver of metabolic syndrome, in part through uric acid. Keep the uric acid down, keep the fructose down. By the way, while you're at it, keep the purines down. That's red meat, because that also raises uric acid too. If you eat a low-carb diet, whether it's a ketogenic diet or a paleo diet or just an Atkins diet, okay, what it means is you're reducing your total carbohydrate and hopefully sugar, and you are raising your dietary fat. So you will generate a higher LDL, but it's going to be that large buoyant LDL, which again is cardiovascularly neutral. That's not the bad guy. On the lab slip, it looks like the bad guy because of these reference ranges that make no sense. But ultimately, the goal is get the small, dense LDL down, and statins don't touch those. The other issue about statins is that 20% of people who go on statins either end up with inflammation of their muscles called rhabdomyolysis, or because statins are actually a mitochondrial toxin by themselves, end up with hyperglycemia, or actually frank diabetes. So the question is, to lower the LDL, that's not important, but to put yourself at risk for hyperglycemia, which is important, is that a good trade? Low-carb diets are in vogue. Ketogenic diets are commonplace now, okay? Keto-friendly stuff in the grocery store. First of all, is it really keto-friendly? How do you know? You think it's been tested? Don't be so sure. Just because it says it's keto-friendly doesn't mean it is. But let's say you're doing your own ketogenic diet at home. You're actually making the food yourself and you know what you're eating. What's going on is that fat is priming that insulin response, but because there's no carbohydrate, you don't release it. It's there, but it's saved up for a rainy day. And then you have that slice of pizza and you break your diet. What's going to happen? Well, you're going to get this big glucose response because your liver is not going to basically absorb any of the glucose because the transporters have gone down. So it's all going to flood your bloodstream. Your beta cell is going to see a higher glucose response because the rest of your body has learned to run on ketones instead of glucose. So you're not even going to be shoveling glucose into cells. And so you're going to get a bigger glucose response. Therefore, you're going to get a bigger insulin response because your beta cells have all of this insulin stored up, waiting to go because it hasn't been called on in weeks and weeks. And so you're going to get this glucose insulin explosion just because you broke the diet. And that is going to drive virtually all that glucose into fat, and it's going to undo that ketogenic diet in one meal. And people who fall out of the ketogenic diet now are not getting the benefits of low carbohydrate anymore. And the reason is because their insulin's gone up. Now they're on a high-fat, medium carbohydrate diet with insulin, which is about the worst diet you can be on. So if you're going to do a ketogenic diet, you have to actually be pretty fastidious about it. I'm for it. I'm not against it. But you can't just play ketogenic. You have to do it. Cholesterol is a funny thing. Cholesterol is necessary. Everybody thinks cholesterol is bad because they've heard it causes heart disease. Cholesterol is absolutely necessary. If you need cholesterol for membranes, you need cholesterol for steroids. Cholesterol is so essential that our body has a method for manufacturing it out of nothing, out of glucose for that matter. So cholesterol gets a bad rap. And the reason is because there are actually multiple cholesterols. There's LDL, there's HDL, and then there's this other one that's not really an LDL at all. It's called triglyceride, but it goes along with it because it's VLDL. And it's got some cholesterol in it. It's not the one that matters, it's the pattern of all of them together that matter. And this is where doctors need to basically go back to med school because all this stuff has changed really in the last 10 years. And your doctor may not know it. LDL has always been thought of as the bad guy. High LDL, oh, you need a statin. Well, there are two LDLs. There's not one, there's two. One's called large buoyant and one's called small dense. They are not the same, except that the LDL assay measures both at the same time. So the lab test says they're the same, but they're not the same. Large buoyant LDL is cardiovascularly neutral, and it's the one that dietary fat raises. So dietary fat turns out to not be very important in terms of cardiovascular disease. Small dense, on the other hand, is very important. Small dense turns out to be the atherogenic particle, or at least an evolution of the atherogenic particle, called remnant cholesterol. And small dense can get under the surface of the endothelial cell in the arteries and start the foam cell formation process that leads to the plaque that leads to the heart disease. And it's more easily oxidized because it's smaller. And so it's the bad guy in the story. And what raises your small dense LDL? Well, the same thing that raises your triglyceride, because that's the thing that gets turned into the small dense LDL. That's sugar. So sugar is the driver of the LDL fraction that generates the heart disease. Dietary fat is not. And then we have HDL. And HDL, for the most part, is good. The higher the HDL, the better off it is. And the reason is because that's also an evolutionary output of LDL once the cholesterol's offloaded. And then that comes back to the liver to be reloaded. So basically, the HDL is a shuttle mechanism. And so the higher the HDL, the better the shuttle mechanism's working.